All right. So this morning we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2. We want to recognize that I do understand those who follow the church calendar, the liturgical calendar, that Advent doesn't actually start until next week. I am aware of that, but this is where my Baptist tendencies come out, and I typically like to begin my Christmas series right after Thanksgiving. and I just want to acknowledge that, and for those of you out there who think that I'm bizarre for starting Advent a week early, it's not because I'm uneducated or unaware. It's just this is how it's working out. And along with that, before I get too far into it, I do want to make sure that I let everyone know that Christmas Eve we are planning to do a Christmas Eve service. So Christmas Eve actually falls on Sunday, so we're going to do 2 church services that day. We're going to do our regular time, so anybody who wants to join us here at the convent at 8 o'clock Sunday morning on the 24th, you're more than welcome to join us there. But we're also going to be doing that evening a Christmas Eve service, and due to some of the elements that are in there, we're not going to be able to live stream all of it, and we're probably not going to be able to set up the live stream to do it anyway. We're gonna look into that, but just so you know, so there we go. Now, I apologize, Matthew chapter 2. I'm going to do something a little different this year as well, in that I've never only stuck with one group of people in the Christmas narrative. I've always, looked at several different people or looked at the Christmas story in different stages, but we're actually going to spend the entire Advent time looking solely at the wise men. Going to be doing a series that I've not so cleverly titled Following the Wise Men, because so many people have already done various takes on the wise men that I knew I couldn't outdo their creativity in titling it. But we're going to follow the wise men through the Advent season, because there's actually a number of things that I think sometimes we overlook in their character, and I want to pull some of that out and take some time really learning from them. And so we're going to begin by reading their account in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, and asked them where the Messiah would be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because that is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him. After hearing the king, they went on their way. And there it was, the star they had seen at its rising. It led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. So, if we're going to follow these guys on their journey, I think it's a fair place to start by asking, who are they? Or should I say, who were they? well, they were 2,000 years ago, so who they are now is probably decayed corpses somewhere. But with that cheery Christmas thought, who were the wise men? Well, the reality is, there's not a lot we know. These 12 verses that I read this morning are all the verses that there are about them within the Bible. Now, tradition has it that they had names. Traditionally, most traditions name them Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar. There are some ancient writings, though, that there's variations on the names. And even a lot of those are later Christian writings that it appears early Christians were trying to fill in the gaps. They were trying to figure out who these guys were, how they fit into the whole story, and what the point was. So the reality is that there's not a lot we actually can say for sure. The word that is used for wise men, some translations use the word magi, because that's a close approximation of what the Greek word that's used here is. Now the interesting thing is magi was actually a class of priestly scholars from what was the old Persian Empire. That old Persian culture was still alive and well in the early first century. As a matter of fact, several different versions of it had actually grown up and taken root. But it was strong. And so this class of Persian priestly scientists was around in that day. Now, if you want, you can identify these magi, these wise men, with that class, and it would make sense. So if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the same word is used to describe some of the people that Daniel encountered in Babylon. The wise men, the mediums, the magicians, and sorcerers that the Babylonian king surrounded himself with. In other words, these people that had both spiritual, mystical, and scientific knowledge, and oftentimes they delved in all of it. That's one of the words that described one of the groups in that class of wise men that eventually Daniel became the head of. So there are many that hold that is who they are, but other scholars have pointed out, and recent scholarship has begun pointing out, that there were actually several different groups that this word, magoi, as it is in Greek here, which is where we get our word magic, which is why it's translated magician, medium, sorcerer in various places. Acts chapter 2, the word shows up, and it's in reference to a sorcerer. As a matter of fact, I think it shows up again a little later in Acts, referencing another sorcerer. But there you have this dichotomy, is the word doesn't actually tell us specifically who we're talking about. It could refer to a number of people. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because, number one, details are limited, and human nature is, we're going to fill in those details. Hence why there are ancient Christian writings that fill in a lot more detail about these wise men, these magi, where they come from. There's several slightly different versions of who they are from that priestly scientist group. Others, other of the early writings have them as warrior kings from some of the Arab nations surrounding Israel, which matches with some of the ancient prophecies that the prophets predicted about how other nations would come to Israel and bear gifts and this, that, and the other. And so there's this big cloud of who were they? And I would simply say we have to content ourselves with the idea they were just wise men. We don't know where they came from. We don't know much else about them. There are some things, and we'll look into some of that. That's part of what we're going to do. But I want us to take a step back and say their origin is of less importance than sometimes we make it out to be. Because sometimes we make out where a person comes from a bit much. Sometimes it's necessary. The first chapter of Matthew spends the majority of it telling us where Jesus came from. It's important. It's important to know where Jesus came from to substantiate the claims that he makes in his life. You have to be able to connect him directly with the line of David. It's a must. If he's the Messiah, he has to be connected. And that's what Matthew does. He goes to great length to show that background of Jesus. But what's interesting is when you read through that background and you read some of the names that are in there, there's a lot of these people that their background, where they came from, is unknown. And some of them, what we do know about them, we wouldn't put them in this list. Even if they were, we'd leave them out. We'd go, everybody has that person in their family history, and some of us have like a family history that every once in a while you find somebody, that's worth mentioning. But everybody has those people that you kind of want to sweep under the rug, Matthew doesn't do that. Matthew pulls out all of it and shows the entire picture of where Jesus came from. But it's important to realize he does that for that purpose of establishing who Jesus is. And also in doing that, he also, by bringing out some of these more unwanted family members, showing that sometimes where you come from is not as important as coming to a point where you experience God in your life and follow him, no matter where you came from. It doesn't matter. Your background, your genealogy, it might be interesting. It's not bad to know, but it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because you're not limited by where you came from. You're not limited by who you are. The only limit you have is the limit that you place on yourself. And if you just let go of that, you can see what God can do for you. Because, you've got people like Rahab. If you remember in the book of Joshua, Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho. But she's in here. Judah and Tamar, if you know that story. That's a little bit bizarre. And I won't go into many details because it's not exactly a PG subject matter here. Excuse me. Ruth, Moabitess. As a matter of fact, what's very interesting is that Matthew brings out all these women, not just because some of them have these really questionable pasts, but because in the genealogy, the Jewish genealogy, the fact that Jesus was connected to David would have to come through all the males in the line, which is interesting. Their Jewishness comes from their mother. How that works, I don't know. I've not studied that deeply. I just know and have been told, and it's been verified for me by people that I know personally, that yes, that's true. That's how that works. So that's a long, drawn out process of telling you we don't know a whole lot about them. But now let's talk about what we do know, because really, the main thing that I want to pull out, at least today, from about who these guys are is these are wise men who were smart enough to know that Jesus was worth seeking, worth finding, and worth worshiping. So what does it take to be the kind of person that knows that Jesus is worth seeking, finding, and worshiping? Well, they had to have been brave. These guys were brave because wherever they come from, it says that they were wise men from the east. Now, I tend to still lean towards the idea that these guys were from ancient Babylon, that they were from that area of the old Persian Empire, east of Israel. So it would have been quite a journey for them to take. But whether it was them or whoever it was going to take some bravery to make a journey to Jerusalem, because it's a long journey. Now, granted, this was a good time in history to make that kind of a journey because the Roman Empire had established a peace, and they'd established a peaceful, highway systems and whatnot. It doesn't mean that they were wonderful. I mean, there were still bandits and there were still bad guys out there. It's just, it was a lot safer in the first century than it was in previous centuries. And Rome was trying to make it safe in their own way. But there was still risk. There was still some danger. Now, what route did they take? We're not told. There were two primary routes they could have taken. One is they could have taken the direct route, which would have taken them right across the Arabian Desert. Many believe that they took that route. Most scholars that I've read anyway would argue they probably didn't take that route. The kinds of dangers that you'd face there are worse than the danger of bandits on the highways. Not to mention, when you leave the highways, that's when you're going to really run the risk of coming sideways of bandits. Now, we don't know how big their company really was. Traditionally, there's 3 wise men. Why? Because there's 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But we don't know. We don't know how many there were, and however many wise men there were, they probably had a whole retinue of people that came along with them. So maybe they weren't worried about bandits. I don't know. If I was going to make a long journey in the ancient world, I'd probably take along some protection as well. But we don't know. But even if they did, there was a certain amount of bravery that they had to get up from their comfy homes and travel. Travel where? We really get the indicate they had a general idea where they were going. They really didn't know specifically. That's why they went to Jerusalem. They're looking for a king, somebody born king of the Jews. So where are you going to go looking for a king? Maybe in the capital city. Let's go see. Let's see if a child has been born. I don't know. They were operating. They must have been educated. They must have known some things. But there were things they didn't know, but they were still willing to act. You might call that faith, right? We all sometimes have to just act in faith. We have to take a step of faith. As a matter of fact, that's what we're all about, is faith. We try to live a life of faith. But it's not an uneducated faith. I think the faith that we're called to is kind of the faith they had, and that is simply act on what you know and have confidence that you will figure out what you need to know when you need to know it. But don't let the lack of knowing stop you. Embrace the adventure of seeking. As a matter of fact, there's a Latin phrase that very popular throughout Christian history, which is translated as faith-seeking understanding. And that's an adventure, and it takes bravery, because it takes bravery for us to acknowledge what we don't know, and bravery to continue pursuing Jesus even when we don't know everything that we feel we should. Sometimes when our lives are falling apart, and it's very tempting to accept the old ideas of, well, God blesses those who are doing what's right, so if something's going terribly wrong in my life, I must not be following God well, or maybe there is no God. I mean, because how can a good God allow all this to happen? A lot of the time, just circumstances in our lives will, excuse me, try to draw us away from following Him. It takes bravery to keep going. You see, wise men were brave enough to seek Jesus. They were also persistent. Like I said, they didn't really know where they were going. They got to Jerusalem, found out He wasn't there. And what did Herod do? He sees these guys, whoever they are, they're making quite a stir, which means, number one, we can be pretty certain they probably were not Jewish. Number two, they probably were pretty well-to-do. I mean, after all, they're carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So they were either well-to-do themselves, or they were well-connected. Either way, they made a stir when they entered Jerusalem, and so Herod's like, who are these guys? What's going on? And all of Jerusalem, it says, was kind of like disturbed by these guys. Meaning, their equilibrium was unbalanced when these guys showed up. And He calls them in. And so they're telling Him what they're looking for, and He doesn't even know. So He calls in His scribes. And all of this. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, that's not too big of a setback. I mean, but others would look at this and say, look, it's every step of the way they're making microscopic advances in their understanding. Is it really worth it? Is it worth continuing? At some point, these guys are going to be like, it was a long journey from wherever we came from. Our food stores are running low. How long are we going to continue looking? Because we're in the capital city, and they're saying, well, He ain't here. Now they're saying He's out at Bethlehem, which was only 7 miles away. But understand, you're not driving a car out there. So you ever tried walking 7 miles? It's going to take a minute to get out there, and you probably got camels. So maybe they're riding. We don't know. Traditionally we think of them riding camels. I would assume they rode something, but not necessarily. But either way, it's still 7 more miles to go out to Podunkville, a tiny little town that and you're not even sure if you're going to find what you're looking for. Some people may have given up. These guys did not. They were persistent. Why? Because they knew that finding Jesus was going to be worth it. Whatever it took, they knew it was worth it. And so they persevered. And so they followed the star, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the future here. Kind of looking forward to that one. Looking at this star that they're following, but essentially, they left home for a star, and they're following the star somehow, some way, having to ask directions here, there, and everywhere. And they kept it up. They were persistent until they found Jesus. They were brave. They were persistent. And they were wise. because they knew that Jesus was with it. Even though Jesus had just been born a very short time before, somehow they were wise enough to know his worth. And to know that no matter where they found him, no matter what circumstances, because when they got to Bethlehem, they say, it says that they found him and entered the house where he was, which indicates that Jesus was staying in a house at the time, perhaps. Yeah. Again, we don't really know how much after his birth this took place. We just know that it was after the birth. He was in the house. Maybe it could have been shortly after, because Mary gives birth in the barn, and maybe the guy that owned the barn is like, you know what, I should not leave a newborn baby out in my barn. Maybe I should invite him into the house. Who knows? It's uncertain exactly what house they found him in, but I'll tell you this much: Bethlehem in the first century wasn't a prosperous city. It wasn't a grand little suburb of Jerusalem either. It was just a podunk little poor town, known mainly for its history as the home of the former King David, and known for its shepherds, because the shepherds of Bethlehem were the ones that usually kept the flocks that the Passover lambs came from. So they didn't walk into some immaculate home and find this rich young ruler and fall and worship him. It was just an old, possibly run down, poor house, and they encountered this poor family and this little child. Somehow they knew his worth. I don't know what they were expecting to find. I suspect that when they set out, they expected to find a rich child from a rich family. Why? Because they went to Jerusalem first. They're looking for a king. Where are you going to look? Let's look at the palace. But they didn't let their expectations drive them completely. When their expectations weren't met by the child, they still understood who he was, and they still worshipped him. And I would say that today we need to keep that in mind as well, because sometimes God doesn't do what we expect. Sometimes following Jesus doesn't turn out like we expect. Sometimes our expectations of who Jesus is and what he does and how he works, they can all be shattered. And at that point, we have a decision to make. Are we going to trust Jesus, or are we going to trust our expectations, our understandings, our ability to put together how God's supposed to work? You see, truly wise people know how to put aside their expectations when those expectations are not met, and still see Jesus. So how do you do that? I think a good person to answer that would be somebody who knew Jesus very well and who struggled with that themselves, and that was one of Jesus' half-brothers, a guy by the name of James. In the gospel accounts, we read that his brothers really didn't seem to believe in him during his lifetime. As a matter of fact, we kind of get a little indication that they mocked him a little bit. And I can believe it. I mean, that's what brothers do. But then James, when he was older, he wrote a letter that is now in the Bible that we call the Book of James. And in it we see that he came to a place in his life where he totally believed in Jesus, in who he was. And in the first chapter, so to speak, now granted, it's a letter. He didn't divide it into chapters and verses. We've talked about this before, but when you go back to read it in the chapter 1 of James, you will run across this verse that says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without criticizing, and it will be given. Why? I think it's because James realized at some point in his life that he was wrong about his brother. And he realized he hadn't been smart. He hadn't spent his life seeking Jesus, finding Jesus, worshiping Jesus, because Jesus was, he grew up in the same household. But even right there, physical proximity doesn't necessarily equal understanding. The wise men traveled from a far distant land because they knew Jesus was worth seeking, finding, and worshiping. James grew up with him right there, so easy to seek and find, and yet he didn't. But at some point he realized he hadn't been smart, he hadn't been wise. But he broke down his pride, and he discovered that God gives wisdom to any. And he does so freely, happily, and without criticizing us. So maybe today we need to look at this narrative, look at these wise men from the East, and say they were wise. And they were wise enough to see Jesus for who he was. And we need to be wise enough to see Jesus for who he is. And the beauty of it is, you can be that wise. You don't have to be as educated as them. You don't have to go on a long distance journey through either the desert or go around some long roundabout way up through, following essentially the Fertile Crescent. You don't have to go on a grand journey to find Jesus. You simply need to pray and ask God to give you wisdom. And he will open your eyes and you will see him. And you will see him as he is. So this Christmas season, as we begin this season of celebration, let's begin it by seeking the one that the wise men sought all those years ago. Let's pray. We thank you, Father, for this day, and we do thank you for this season that we're entering into, a season of hope, peace, joy, and love. A season in which we celebrate so many things, but most of all, we celebrate the miracle of you sending your Son into our world. I pray, Lord, that during this season we would not lose sight of Jesus. I pray that all of the celebrations and everything that goes along with this time of year, that it would all enhance our focus on Jesus. And give us the wisdom to seek find and know Jesus as he really is. I thank you, I praise you, and I ask this in Jesus' name.